A 90-year-old in China is detained by police. She's been fighting for her rights for more than a decade after her home was torn down by authorities. Some of China's richest are now behind bars. That's after they were recruited by the Chinese Communist Party and got a little too involved in its internal power struggle. Is Xi Jinping the cause for the Chinese regime's aggression? The daughter of Mao Zedong's secretary says the CCP has long sought global dominance. And the U.S. Commerce Secretary is found to own a stake in a Chinese tech giant. The corporation owns messaging app WeChat, which is now under review by the Commerce Department. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Before we start, our videos are being censored. Make sure you don't lose access to NTD's content by subscribing to our newsletter. Just sign up at newsletter.ntd.com, where you'll be able to access all of our news content and video programs. A 90-year-old woman from Shanghai was arrested for defending her rights. She's yet to receive compensation after authorities tore down her house by force over a decade ago. NTD's Xiong has more.
Liu Shijun is a 90-year-old Chinese citizen from Shanghai. She says she was arrested, detained, and threatened by local police after she defended her rights before city authorities last week. Liu's daughter Cui Fufeng and another person seeking justice from the city were also taken to the police station. That's because they attempted to record the police's actions on their phones. Their devices were confiscated and all videos were deleted. They weren't released from custody until after police officers threatened them to keep quiet. 16 years ago, Liu's house was forcibly destroyed by authorities. They reclaimed the property in order to make way for other, more profitable construction projects. After more than a decade, she's still waiting for compensation. Liu tried to file a petition with the city last Wednesday. While waiting outside the town hall, she held a cardboard sign explaining her cause. But police officers soon showed up, ripping her sign away from her before dragging her into a police car. On the ride to the police station, she says police scolded her. Her daughter later questioned the police about their actions and on whether it's right to treat a 90-year-old that way. She reportedly told them they ought to go ask their parents if the behavior was appropriate. The officers beat her and called her names in response.
The police threw me onto the ground and beat me up. My clothes were also torn. I couldn't get up from the ground.
Cui said she had also been assaulted by city workers last October, adding that her blood pressure has been unstable since then. She's had to carry a blood pressure meter 24/7 because of it. But that's not all.
I've been sent to a labor camp. I have been detained. My mother is 90 years old and she was sent to a detention center last year. There is nowhere to uphold justice in China. How can we live like this?
Back in January of last year, Liu was handcuffed and brought to a detention center at 89 years old. During her few days there, she was also denied medical treatment. Liu's house in Shanghai's Pudong district was demolished in 2005. The area is one of China's most economically developed. Xiong, NTD News.
The Chinese regime is in the middle of its most important political meeting of the year, called the Two Sessions. The two in its name refers to both the National People's Congress, which is often called China's rubber stamp legislature, and the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, or CPPCC. The regime calls the latter an advisory body for the Chinese Communist Party. Though it has no official role in the policy-making process and is actually a key part of the party's United Front Work Department. That's the same department that controls Beijing's propaganda output. The committee recruits influential Chinese people from non-political spheres, like business, academia, the entertainment industry, and religious and ethnic minorities, and asks them to help further the Communist Party's agenda. Its chief officer often echoes the need to hold the line on Communist Party policy. And the body's members are sometimes called political vases. Committee members in the business field are known to be the richest, like Ma Zedong. He's the founder and CEO of tech giant Tencent Holdings and is the richest entrepreneur to attend the Two Sessions conference in 2021. While the CEO of another tech giant, NetEase's Ding Lei, is the third richest of the tycoons recruited by the Chinese regime. The son of Li Ka-shing, Hong Kong's richest man, is in fourth place. According to Taiwanese media, the wealth of the Two Sessions tycoons has increased by an average of nearly 70% over the past year. That value of the increase is higher than Hong Kong's GDP last year. But those same tycoons are also often among the first the regime targets. In 2015, data company Huawei published a report on China's problematic tycoons. It shows that among the tycoons featured on the Huawei 100 rich list over the past 17 years, 18 of them were serving prison time, 11 had been released from prison, 5 were waiting for criminal sentencing, and 1 was executed. Analysts told Radio Free Asia that many Chinese tycoons ended up in prison, explaining that it's a near inevitable result of collusion between the regime and business field. Regime officials use their power to provide privileges and facilities for businessmen, and businessmen return the favor by forming alliances based on common interests. But when involved officials get into trouble because of the regime's internal power struggle, the tycoons are also often investigated and taken down in the name of economic wrongdoings along with them. While U.S. politicians are trying to pass the $1.9 trillion pandemic relief bill, people in China are getting fewer subsidies from the regime. The country's low-income farmers are one of the first groups to feel the strain. NTD's Becky Zhou has the story.
Starting this month, farmers in China's Guangxi province will have to pay a lot more for health insurance. Based on official documents, annual medical insurance premiums before March were equivalent to $40 per person. But soon, that price tag will skyrocket, all the way up to $110. The shift takes effect this month because the number of healthcare subsidies have been cancelled.
The poor can't afford it. Where can they get that kind of money? Especially nowadays when the prices for everything are rising.
The new premium now makes up about 1/10 of locals' average annual income. China's Premier Li Keqiang said last May that 600 million people in China made the equivalent of $1,800 a year. And just last month, the regime claimed all Chinese farmers had been lifted out of poverty, noting that their annual income reached at least $600.
That's nonsense and impossible. The officials are absolutely lying.
By announcing that all farmers are now out of poverty, the regime can ask them to pay more for insurance. Mr. Wang says he doesn't get the insurance, even if he can afford it. He explained hospitals in China have become for-profit organizations and sometimes charge patients hundreds of dollars for minor ailments. Wang added that he will only go to the hospital if he develops a serious medical condition, and if the treatment is too expensive, he will either try to borrow money from relatives or just endure the pain at home. In China's rural communities, it's fairly common for there to be a lack of health insurance. Instead,
health insurance like cooperatives in rural areas help people with serious illnesses. Everyone pays a small amount of money to these agencies, which are similar to insurance companies, but the coverage is very limited.
Even for those farmers who do buy medical insurance, they still have to pay their entire medical bills upfront at hospitals. After a period of time, the insurance company will then reimburse part of their expenses. According to China's public data, the percentage of expenses that patients can claim varies from urban to rural areas. It can be anywhere from 40 to 90%. China's state-run media reports say insurance premiums will continue to rise across China this year. Reporting by Becky Zhou, NTD News.
A mother in China is calling for help to rescue her dying son. He's currently detained in a Chinese prison because he refuses to abandon his beliefs. NTD's Sydney Wang has more.
A Falun Gong practitioner is dying from organ failure in prison. His desperate mother is now calling for his rescue. The report comes from Minghui.com, a U.S.-based website that reports on the persecution of Falun Gong in China. Zhou Xiangyang is a Falun Gong practitioner from Tianjin and works as an engineer. Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa, is a spiritual practice that involves slow-moving meditative exercises and teaches the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. It's the second time Zhou has served prison time for refusing to give up his beliefs. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison back in 2003. Reports say he endured torture while in prison, via methods like receiving electrical shocks all night, being forced to stay awake for over 30 days straight, and being brutally force-fed. despite the suffering, he still refused to renounce his faith. So after his release, he was later thrown back in jail at the end of 2016. He was sentenced another 7 years in prison. Recently, Zhou began a hunger strike to fight against the persecution of Falun Gong. His mother told Minghui that she hasn't heard from her son in 10 months. The prison banned all visitors, citing the pandemic. She says she heard from other prisoners that her son is now suffering from organ failure and had been sent to the prison's hospital. Zhou's mother maintains the freedom of belief is basic human rights. She's now calling for help to save her son. According to Minghui's statistics, 8 people have passed away due to the persecution this February, and 120 people received related sentences. The website's statistics are limited and likely incomplete, as it's near impossible to get full information out of China. More than 60 practitioners between 70 to 90 years old have also been detained or harassed. Reporting by Sydney Wang, NTD News.
Democracies around the world now have access to a list of Chinese officials involved in the persecution of the meditation practice Falun Gong. These countries can now decide what to do with those on the list. Recently, Falun Gong practitioners from 38 countries submitted a list of people from the CCP's so-called 610 office. The practitioners demanded that their respective governments sanction those Chinese officials, ban their entry into the country, and freeze their foreign assets. The list includes 9,300 CCP officials, all the way from the party's central level to its local branches. Falun Gong practitioners submitted the list to 38 countries, including the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, South Korea, and Israel, among others. The 610 office is a special organization of the Chinese Communist regime. Then CCP head Jiang Zemin established it to persecute Falun Gong practitioners on June 10, 1999. Hence the name 610. The office has issued secret orders saying they need to, quote, ruin Falun Gong practitioners' reputation, destroy them financially, and exterminate them physically. Some might argue the Chinese Communist Party became more aggressive because of Xi Jinping. But the daughter of Mao Zedong's personal secretary says the party's global ambition never changed. NTD's Penny Zhou has the details.
The daughter of a communist leader's secretary is shedding light on the Chinese regime. For decades, Western scholars, politicians, and businesses weren't really looking at the Chinese regime as an aggressive communist state. Some have blamed the current Chinese leadership for the regime's increasing aggression in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Taiwan, and infiltration to the rest of the world. But Li Nanyang, the daughter of former communist leader Mao Zedong's personal secretary, says otherwise. She argues that the Chinese Communist Party's ambition to achieve global dominance and establish communist rule was present from the very beginning. Li's father, Li Rui, was among the first to join the CCP in the 1920s. He was considered a more open-minded party member and spent years in prison for criticizing some of the CCP's policies. He had openly called for free speech and constitutional government. Li, now based in the U.S., went through her father's notebooks. Inside them were records of internal meetings dating back to the CCP's early years. It reveals the party's vow to bring down the United States and to establish its own rule began even before it took power in China in 1949. In an interview with NTD's Chinese language program Focus Talk, Li shared some content from the notes.
In 1947, there was an article written by senior CCP member Lu Dingyi. It goes like this: "The day will come when all mankind will sing a song of triumph over the American imperialists."
The article came out just before U.S. Special Envoy to China George Marshall met with Mao Zedong's insurgent communists. At the meeting, the communist leaders made promises about the CCP's vision for a democratic Chinese government. Marshall later pressured the then Chinese nationalist government to stop attacking the CCP, which lessened the pushbacks the CCP had been facing.
Then on November 19, 1950, that's about a year after the Communist Party seized power in China, Deng Zihui, who was at the time in charge of the CCP's Southern Bureau, made a report to my father and other province-level propaganda cadres. And there was one part that goes like this: "We don't solve the world's problems through a big war, but through revolutionary erosion. We impose change from within, step by step."
Based on another section from her father's note in 1950, the CCP had never planned to coexist with the United States. Instead, the party used terms like imperialism to refer to the U.S. and its global influence.
My father took these notes from a political report. It questioned what the historical mission of the Communist Party was after it seized power in China. It was to combat and eliminate imperialism worldwide, adding that if the party does not do this, China couldn't be strong, and that the CCP won't coexist with imperialism.
By the end of the 1970s, the Cultural Revolution had already brought China into political and economic turmoil. That's when the CCP changed course. Its leader Deng Xiaoping started to allow a market economy and encouraged engagement with the West, though his goal was not to change China into a capitalist society.
Here is one note from my father from September 21, 1983, during a meeting with the organization department. It covers one of Deng Xiaoping's internal speeches, saying, Deng said it's wrong to say that our reform and openness policy means we are surrendering to the U.S., as some people are saying. That's not the case. Socialism will win. Capitalism will lose. The reform and openness policy will not surrender. It's just one of our steps. The purpose of our openness policy is to develop socialism by introducing the West's technology and advanced management methods.
Li said even the more open-minded leaders in the Communist Party, like Hu Yaobang, held to the CCP's global ambitions.
On December 9, 1983, Hu Yaobang returned from a visit to Japan and was doing a report about the visit. So what did he say? We have to take our time. We cannot reap the benefits all at once. When we make contacts with those capitalist countries, we need to take our time to introduce their technology into China and reap the benefits gradually. We have to cast out a long line in order to catch a big fish to talk to them about trust, about friendship, and about righteousness. We cannot fix our eyes only on the 5 communist countries, but must look at the bigger picture to improve the country, to lead the whole world towards communism, to communize the Eastern and Western civilizations, so that we can raise our heads and be proud again.
She explains that time and leadership changes may have altered the specific methods used by the CCP, but that the end goals haven't changed.
Think about what Xi Jinping is doing today. Sometimes people think he is returning to the Mao Zedong era of doing things. But in fact, from Deng Xiaoping to Hu Yaobang to Xi Jinping, their basic point is consistent. Their most important thing is to implement the beautiful communism system in the world and to make sure that after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Chinese Communist Party leads the world.
Penny Zhou, NTD News.
The U.S. Commerce Secretary owns a stake in a major Chinese tech corporation and parent company to Chinese messaging app WeChat. The news comes to light at the same time the Commerce Department is reviewing a ban on the app. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo and her husband own a stake in tech company Tencent. Their share is valued between $20,000 and $45,000. That's based on a financial disclosure filed in January with the Office of Government Ethics. Prior to her recent confirmation as Commerce Secretary, Raimondo promised to divest her other financial stakes to avoid potential conflicts of interest, but she failed to mention the Tencent stake. Raimondo and her husband did not invest directly into Tencent. They invested into 2 funds composed of foreign stocks, though Tencent holds the largest position in the 2 funds. But it's not clear whether those 2 funds would be considered a conflict of interest by the U.S. laws. That's because each of them involves several sectors. The Biden administration is reviewing the previous administration's executive orders related to China, including the order that banned transactions with Tencent. In February, Biden's Justice Department asked an appeals court to pause a case concerning the ban while it reviews the action. U.S. Senator Marsha Blackburn is questioning the National Basketball Association's latest business move, a deal with Chinese state television CCTV. The broadcaster resumed airing regular NBA programming over the weekend. Blackburn expressed her concerns to the Epoch Times. She said the NBA games would be broadcast on the same station that regularly airs communist propaganda and forced confessions from prisoners in Chinese detention. She asked the NBA to give details on the new deal by the end of this month. including whether the agreement bans the NBA from speaking about some of China's most sensitive topics, like Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Xinjiang. More than a year ago, the NBA angered the Chinese Communist regime as then Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey tweeted in support of Hong Kong's pro-democracy protesters. As a result, Chinese businesses cut ties with the league, and CCTV stopped airing NBA games. The league also sparked controversy in July of 2020. That's when an investigation by sports channel ESPN revealed Chinese coaches at the NBA Youth Training Academy in Xinjiang had physically abused players. The NBA later terminated its relationship with the academy. Chinese telecom giant Huawei is expanding its global infrastructure build-up to yet another area: undersea internet cables. Huawei will soon be building new internet cables for France. It's going to be a 7,500 miles long undersea cable. It will start in China and end up at the French port of Marseille. Huawei's involvement in the infrastructure has raised security concerns. That's for its poor security record. Under Chinese law, it is required to share information with the CCP. In 2019, the U.S. put Huawei on a trade blacklist. It deemed Huawei a national security threat. As per Bloomberg, the French port is an easy spot for cable tapping. There's a risk that Huawei might build backdoors during the construction, and that would allow it to steal information. Former U.S. Air Force General Robert Spalding says that Chinese cables and switches are the source of redirecting traffic and eavesdropping. Last year, then U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned the international community about the Chinese regime's subversion of intelligence through undersea cables. Despite the warning, the French government still allowed Huawei to build the cable. About 400 cables transport around 98% of the world's internet data and telephone traffic. The U.S. owns many of them. Meanwhile, China has an 11% stake in the world's undersea cables as of 2019. Now we look to Hong Kong. A third person has died after receiving Chinese-made CCP virus vaccines. The man was in his 70s. He died 4 days after receiving the Sinovac vaccine shots. Sinovac is a Beijing-based pharmaceutical company, and it is one of the 3 vaccines that Hong Kong authorities use to vaccinate its residents. This is the 3rd time in 8 days that a Hong Kong resident died after receiving CCP virus vaccines. 2 other residents are also under intensive care after receiving Sinovac shots. So far, almost 100,000 Hong Kongers have received their first dose of the Sinovac vaccine. Hong Kong authorities have yet to decide whether the man's death is linked to the vaccine shots. They are waiting for an autopsy report for further investigation. And more on Chinese vaccines, questions are now rising over when China started developing its virus vaccines. This comes after a surprise reveal from the CEO of Chinese state-owned vaccine maker Sinopharm. The CEO, Yu Qingming, boasted about Sinopharm vaccine's efficacy in a media interview. He says some leaders in his company received the CCP virus vaccine last March. And after a year, these leaders still have a relatively high level of virus antibodies. Chinese authorities only admitted the virus spreads from human to human last January. This means the Sinopharm leaders were vaccinated just 2 months later. This raises questions of when vaccine development really started. The Chinese regime's mouthpiece, Global Times, is hitting back at the concern. It claims questions over vaccine development are conspiracy theories from ill-intended Western media. It also says China was able to achieve such success because of mature technology and devoted researchers. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.